The boardroom on the 43rd floor of the Voss Tower has never been this quiet. 23 executives sit frozen around a table worth more than most people's houses, and none of them are breathing right. At the head of the table, Adrian Voss, the man who built a $2 billion empire through sheer force of will and a complete intolerance for being wrong, holds a financial report in both hands like he might tear it in half. The numbers on page 7 are his numbers. His projections. His acquisition strategy, approved by every person in this room 6 weeks ago without a single objection. And the woman sitting at the far end of the table, the one who has been here 11 days, whose name half these people still haven't bothered to learn, just told him they're wrong. If you've ever wanted to watch someone hand a lit match to the most dangerous man in the city, stay with me. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Elara Whitmore almost didn't take the job. She'd spent 6 years building a clean, manageable life at a mid-sized auditing firm in the financial district. The kind of place where competence was rewarded with slightly better parking and a gift card at Christmas. She wasn't ambitious in the way that word gets used in business schools. She didn't want empires or corner offices or her name on a building. She wanted the numbers to add up. That was the whole thing for her. It was that simple and that stubborn. The Voss Consortium recruiter had called her on a Tuesday in October, when the trees outside her office window were burning orange, and she was eating a turkey sandwich over a spreadsheet she already knew had a problem on row 47. The recruiter's voice was the kind of smooth that comes from too much practice, and he'd used the phrase transformative opportunity twice in the first 90 seconds, which made Elara set down her sandwich. She knew the Voss Consortium. Everyone in the financial world knew the Voss Consortium. Adrian Voss had founded it 17 years ago with inherited capital and a mind that apparently processed risk the way other people processed oxygen, automatically, constantly, without conscious effort. He'd made 3 acquisitions in his first 2 years that most analysts called reckless. All 3 had tripled in value within 5 years. Since then, the company had become a kind of financial weather system, something other businesses tracked and tried to predict and mostly failed to understand. What people said about Adrian Voss himself was less flattering and probably more accurate. That he didn't tolerate mistakes. That he'd fired a VP of finance on the man's first day for a typo in a memo. That he once walked out of a merger negotiation because the other party's legal team arrived 7 minutes late and didn't apologize. That his standard for human performance was calibrated to a frequency no actual human could consistently hit, and he knew it and didn't care. Elara had told the recruiter she needed to think about it. She'd thought about it for approximately 4 minutes, mostly while finishing her sandwich, and then called back and said yes. Not because of the salary, though the salary was significant. Not because of the prestige, which she didn't particularly value. She said yes because the recruiter, when she'd pressed him on the specifics of the role, had accidentally revealed that the forensic audit of the Hartwell Media acquisition, a deal worth nearly $400 million, had been completed in-house by a team that reported directly to the CFO who'd recommended the acquisition in the first place. That was the kind of thing that made Elara's jaw tighten, the kind of structural problem that sat quietly inside organizations like a slow leak, invisible until the ceiling came down. She took the job because someone needed to look at those numbers, and apparently nobody had. Her first week at the consortium's headquarters, 43 floors of glass and steel in the center of the city, a building that seemed designed to make you feel slightly inadequate just by standing next to it, was an education in institutional discomfort. People were polite to her face in the cautious, deliberate way that meant they were uncertain whether she had power, which meant they were uncertain whether she was dangerous, which meant they defaulted to surface-level warmth and gave her nothing real. Her office was small. That was fine. The view was of a concrete parking structure. That was less fine, but she'd worked in worse places. What mattered was the access she'd been promised to the full financial records of the last 8 quarters. She started pulling files the morning of day 2. By day 4, she had a problem. By day 7, she had a confirmed problem, triple-checked, cross-referenced against the original acquisition documents, the due diligence filings, and 2 separate external market analyses she'd requested from the company's own research department under a pretense she wasn't proud of, but didn't lose sleep over. The Hartwell acquisition, the one that had been announced to shareholders as a strategic masterstroke, the one that Adrian Voss himself had championed in a 40-minute presentation to the board, contained an $18 million valuation error buried inside a subsidiary asset assessment. It wasn't fraud. It was worse in its own quiet way. It was carelessness that had been dressed up in enough technical language that nobody with the authority to catch it had bothered to actually read it. The error had downstream effects on 3 separate financial projections that the board was currently using to plan a second acquisition. On the morning of day 11, Elara requested to be added to the agenda of the weekly executive strategy meeting. The woman who managed Adrian Voss's calendar, a composed, silver-haired person named Margaret, who wore excellent shoes and communicated in a language of subtle facial expressions, had looked at Elara for a long moment before asking what the meeting was regarding. "A correction," Elara said. Margaret's expression did something that wasn't quite a wince. "I'll see what I can do." She was added to the agenda. 8th item. Last item, as it happened, which meant she'd have to sit through 7 other items watching people perform competence for the man at the head of the table. She got there early. She sat at the far end of the table, which was as far as you could get from Adrian Voss while still being in the same room, and she placed her documents in a neat stack in front of her and spent the next 22 minutes watching the 7 items before hers. He was different in person than she'd expected, which was its own interesting data point. She'd expected something louder, the loud confidence of a man who'd built something enormous and wanted everyone to remember it. What she got was quieter than that. Adrian Voss didn't fill the room with his voice. He filled it with his attention. When he was focused on a person, you could feel it from across the table, a quality of presence that made you want to either perform better or get out of the building. She watched 2 senior VPs stumble through presentations they'd clearly done before, their usual fluency suddenly unreliable under that particular quality of focus. He asked questions that sounded simple and weren't. He had a way of letting silence do the work, asking something and then waiting without any visible impatience while the other person processed the fact that the question was harder than it had appeared and reconstructed their answer and delivered something more honest than what they'd originally planned. It was an effective technique. It was probably unconscious, which made it more effective. When the 7th item concluded and the room began the small collective exhale that marks the near end of a long meeting, Margaret's voice came from the side of the room. "Mr. Voss, there's one additional item. Ms. Whitmore requested time to present a finding." 22 heads turned toward the far end of the table. The 23rd head, the one that mattered, turned last, and more slowly, and with a quality of appraisal that felt less like curiosity and more like measurement. "Whitmore," Adrian said. Not a question. More like he was testing the name against something. "Forensic accounting. I started 11 days ago." She kept her voice flat. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Level, the way she always tried to keep it, because level was the only register that didn't give people something to grab onto. "I know who you are." He picked up his water glass, settled back slightly in his chair, and looked at her with that measuring quality. "You have 10 minutes. It took her 4. She walked him through it the way she walked everyone through problems, methodically, without dramatics, starting with the source document and moving forward through the chain of errors like a person following a trail. She didn't editorialize. She didn't suggest that someone had been negligent, though the implication was present in every step. She just showed him where the number came from, what it should have been, and what the difference meant in concrete terms. $18 million in overstated subsidiary value, downstream effects on projected earnings across 3 fiscal quarters, second acquisition planning currently based on projections that incorporated the error. When she finished, she set the final page face down on the table and waited. The room was the quietest it had been all morning. It had a specific quality, that silence, the kind that happens when a large number of people are simultaneously trying to figure out whether to look at her or at him, and have decided that looking at either one might be read as taking a side, so they're all studying the table or their hands, or some middle distance that commits them to nothing. Adrian Voss was looking at her. His face hadn't changed much while she talked. A slight tension around the eyes, maybe, but nothing she could have sworn to. He'd picked up a report at some point and was holding it in both hands without looking at it, which meant either he'd absorbed it already or he was using the physical action of holding it to give himself a moment to think. She waited. She was good at waiting. Numbers waited. The truth about numbers waited. She'd learned a long time ago that the people who got nervous in the silence and started talking to fill it were the people who lost control of their own findings. The silence stretched to 10 seconds. 20. One of the VPs near the middle of the table cleared his throat very quietly, which accomplished nothing except establishing that he was also uncomfortable. Then Adrian Voss set the report down on the table, squared it with the edge, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't been expecting at all. Something that might, on a different face in a different room, have been almost like relief. "Continue," he said. It was one word. But the way he said it, not like an order exactly, more like he was opening a door he hadn't been sure existed, made something in the room shift. She couldn't have said what precisely. The air pressure, maybe. The orientation of 23 human bodies suddenly recalibrating their sense of what was about to happen. She continued. She spent the next 11 minutes walking him through the corrected numbers, the adjusted projections, and 3 specific recommendations for structural changes to the due diligence process that would prevent a similar error from being missed in the future. She did not soften the recommendations. She did not frame them as suggestions. She stated them as the logical conclusions of the evidence, because that's what they were. He asked 4 questions. They were good questions, the kind that cut to load-bearing assumptions rather than details. And she answered each one directly, without qualification, because the math supported direct answers. When she finished the second time, the meeting concluded within minutes. People gathered their things with the particular efficiency of people who want to leave a room before they're asked anything. Elara was stacking her own documents when she registered that Adrian Voss was still at the head of the table. Not leaving. Watching her. "My CFO reviewed that acquisition," he said. "I know. He's been with the company 9 years. The error is on page 42 of the subsidiary assessment. The language in the preceding section is technically accurate in a way that makes the problem easy to read past if you're moving quickly." A pause. "Were you suggesting he was negligent or incompetent?" "I was suggesting the process created conditions for a significant error to persist undetected." She looked at him directly. "That's a structural problem, not a personnel one." He studied her for another moment. She got the sense he was recalibrating something, the way you do when a piece of information arrives that doesn't fit your existing model. "You've been here 11 days, he said. "Yes. And in 11 days you found something that everyone else missed." She considered this carefully because she knew what the wrong answer would do. "I found something that the existing review process wasn't designed to find. I was hired specifically to look for things like this." A beat. "I'd be worse at my job than your CFO is at his if I hadn't found it." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the precursor to one. "Come to my office at 3, he said. "Bring the full documentation." He left. The room breathed again. Margaret was the last one there besides Elara, collecting materials from the credenza near the door. She paused as she passed. "In 9 years, she said quietly, without looking up from what she was doing, "I have never seen him say, 'Continue.'" Then she walked out, and Elara stood alone in the empty boardroom for a moment, looking at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and wondered what exactly she'd just stepped into. The meeting at 3 was different from what she'd expected, though she was starting to recalibrate her expectations in general where Adrian Voss was concerned. His office was large but not ostentatious. The furniture was expensive and almost aggressively simple, the kind of restraint that costs more than extravagance. One wall was entirely glass, looking out over the city. The opposite wall was bookshelves, actual books rather than the decorative kind, with the broken spines and post-it markers of things that had actually been read. He was on the phone when she arrived and waved her to a chair without looking up, which she appreciated. It was a functional gesture rather than a territorial one. "Come sit while I finish rather than wait until I'm ready to acknowledge you." She sat. She didn't look at her phone or her documents. She looked at the city through the glass wall and thought about what she still needed to check in the financial records. When he ended the call, he turned and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Tell me about the process change you'd recommend," he said. "Not the version for the boardroom, the real version." So she told him. It took 45 minutes. He interrupted 4 times, all good interruptions, the kind that push you to be more specific rather than the kind that pull you off track. He pushed back on 2 of her recommendations with objections that were actually substantive, and she answered both of them directly, and on one of them she conceded that his alternative had merit, because it did, and on the other she held her position because the math supported holding it. He was quiet for a moment after she held her position. "Nobody disagrees with me in this building," he said. "Not quite complaint, not quite observation." "I noticed," she said. "Does that make you nervous?" "Not particularly. Should it?" The almost smile again. She was beginning to think it was as close as he usually got. "Most people who come in here to tell me I'm wrong are doing it because they want something. I want the projections to be accurate. That's all." "That's everything," she said. "If the projections are wrong, the decisions are wrong. If the decisions are wrong at the scale this company operates, that's a significant problem for a significant number of people." He looked at her with that quality of focused attention, and she didn't look away from it, and something in the room shifted again. A different kind of shift than the one in the boardroom, quieter and less definable. "I'll implement the process changes," he said. "I want weekly reports from you directly, not through the CFO." She held that for a moment. "That will create a structural tension in the reporting hierarchy." "Yes." "You're comfortable with that?" "I'm comfortable with accurate information. The hierarchy can adapt." He picked up a pen, which seemed to be his signal that the meeting was ending. "You're going to find more problems." It wasn't a question. "Almost certainly," she said. "Good." He looked back at his desk. "Send me your first weekly report by Friday." She stood, gathered her documents, and was halfway to the door when he spoke again. "Whitmore." She turned. "The CFO," he said. "Don't worry about him." She held that for a moment, trying to read it. Warning, instruction, some combination. "I don't worry about people," she said. "I worry about processes." She left. In the elevator going down, she noticed her hands were perfectly steady, which she checked because she always checked when she came out of an adrenaline-adjacent situation, and she was always slightly surprised when they were. Steady hands? Good. The numbers on the floor above were a different story. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Elara had experienced in her professional life, and she'd worked in environments that people described as demanding, with the tone of voice that means something harder than that. The Voss Consortium operated at a velocity that exposed every inefficiency in its path, and because she was now the person responsible for finding those inefficiencies before they became disasters, she worked at a velocity she hadn't sustained since grad school. She found 4 more problems in the first month. Not all of them were as significant as the Hartwell error. One was a rounding methodology in the quarterly tax calculation that had been producing a minor but consistent discrepancy for 2 years, and another was a contract renewal process that created a recurring window of exposure that nobody had formally identified. But one of them was significant, a liability classification in one of the consortium's European holdings that had been categorized in a way that, if it remained uncorrected at the time of a planned regulatory audit, would likely trigger a formal inquiry. She brought it to Adrian in a Tuesday morning meeting, same way she'd brought the first one. Same flat voice, same direct presentation, same refusal to editorialize or soften. He listened the same way he'd listened the first time, completely, without defensiveness, asking the kind of questions that meant he was actually tracking the logic. Then he said, "How long have we had this classification?" 18 months. A pause. "My legal team should have caught it. Their scope didn't include cross-jurisdictional liability mapping for holdings under a certain asset threshold. This one fell below the threshold." "By how much?" $4 million. "So the threshold needs to change." "The threshold needs to change," she agreed. He wrote something down. She'd started to notice he wrote things down rather than typing them, which meant either he was more comfortable with paper or he'd found that writing things created a different kind of retention than typing, and she'd decided it was probably the second thing. "You're going to keep finding these," he said. Same thing he'd said the first time. The organization has been growing fast enough that the compliance infrastructure hasn't kept pace. That's a predictable consequence of the growth trajectory. I'll keep finding things until the infrastructure catches up. He looked at her. What do you need? She had the list ready because she always came to these meetings with the list ready. 3 additional analysts, direct reporting authority for certain audit functions that currently required CFO approval, and access to a data system the consortium used for internal communications that she currently couldn't query without going through IT. He said yes to all 3. The CFO, a man named Gerald Holt, who had been with the company since before 2 of its largest acquisitions and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had survived a lot of organizational changes, began looking at her differently after that. Not with hostility, exactly. With something more complicated. She could see him trying to decide what she was, threat or asset, and not being able to land on an answer, which probably meant the answer was both. She made a point of keeping their professional interactions clean and direct. She didn't go around him when she didn't need to. She flagged things to him that were in his proper purview and didn't require escalation. She wasn't performing collegiality. She genuinely didn't have the energy for performance. But she understood that the organization would work better if the reporting structures weren't more fractured than they needed to be. And working better was the point. In her 5th week, Gerald knocked on her door. She looked up from a spreadsheet. "I've been trying to figure you out," he said. He had a flat Midwestern quality to his voice, honest in a way that she respected even when she found him frustrating. He came in without being invited and sat in the chair across from her desk, which was a territorial thing but not an aggressive one. "I've been here 9 years. I've seen a lot of people come in here with the mandate to improve things. You know what most of them actually want. Recognition," she said. "A faster path to something they already want." "Right." He looked at her. "What do you want?" "The numbers to be right." He studied her for a long moment. "That simple." "That complicated," she corrected. "But yes." He was quiet. She turned back to her spreadsheet and waited, because she could feel that he hadn't finished. "The European holding," he said finally. "I'm the one who signed off on that classification." "I know. You didn't say that when you brought it to him." "It wasn't relevant to the solution. The solution is the threshold change in a retrospective review." Another pause. He could have used it to... He stopped. "I know," she said again. He stood up, moved toward the door, stopped. "The Hartwell assessment, the section before page 42. I wrote 3 of those paragraphs." She looked up from the spreadsheet. "I was in a hurry," he said, not making an excuse, just telling her. The close timeline was a real thing. I convinced myself the subsidiary valuation was close enough. She held that. "How often does close enough show up in your work?" "Not often." A beat. "More often than it should." She nodded. That was the most honest thing she'd heard from anyone in this building, and she recognized it as such. "If you want, I can build a secondary review protocol for anything in your scope above a certain threshold. Not to create oversight, to give you a backstop." He looked at her. "You'd do that. It's part of what I'm here for." He left without saying anything else. But something in the way he moved was different, less careful, or differently careful. She went back to her spreadsheet. The weekly report she gave Adrian became something she found herself spending unexpected amounts of time on, not because she was worried about how they'd be received, but because she found that writing them clearly was harder than the underlying analysis. He read them with the same complete attention he gave everything, and his responses, sometimes verbal in their Tuesday meetings, sometimes a few written sentences on the printed copy returned to her desk, were always substantive. He didn't praise her work. He engaged with it, which she found more useful. He had a habit that she only started noticing in the 2nd month. He signed documents without reading them. Not all documents, not the major ones, the acquisition papers, the board filings, the regulatory submissions, but the smaller ones, the routine authorizations and internal approvals and budget sign-offs that moved across his desk in a constant paper current, he signed with a practiced efficiency that made her understand, in a specific and uncomfortable way, that he trusted the people bringing him documents to have done the reading already. The problem with that was she was discovering, week by week, that the people bringing him documents didn't always do the reading. She brought it up in the 7th week, after she'd flagged 2 separate authorizations that, had they been signed as presented, would have created compliance problems she'd have spent weeks cleaning up. "You sign things without reviewing them," she said. He looked up from his desk. "I have people for that. 2 of the things you almost signed this month would have created problems I'd have spent significant time correcting." "Almost signed," he said, "because you caught them." "Because I happened to be in the loop. That's not a process, that's luck." She placed the 2 documents on his desk. "You should implement a mandatory pre-signature checklist for authorizations above a certain value. It takes 4 minutes, and it eliminates this category of risk." He looked at the documents, then at her. "You're telling me how to run my desk," he said. "I'm telling you how to reduce a category of error that currently depends on luck to catch." She held his gaze. "You can tell me to stay in my lane if that's what you want." A long pause. The kind that on a different face would have been threatening. On his, she was starting to read it as something closer to processing. "Draft the checklist," he said. She drafted it. It was implemented the following week. He never mentioned it again, and neither did she. And twice in the following month, Margaret quietly sent her a note saying that the checklist had caught something before it went to his desk. By the end of the 2nd month, Elara had become, in ways she hadn't designed and didn't entirely understand, something between an auditor and a specific kind of organizational conscience. People brought things to her before they brought them anywhere else. Not because they'd been told to, but because they'd noticed what happened when things got to Adrian without going through her first. She didn't love this. It wasn't her job, and it created exactly the kind of structural ambiguity she generally tried to avoid. She thought about raising it, and then she thought about what raising it would require. A conversation about roles and authority that would generate more organizational friction than the current informal arrangement. And she filed it in the category of problems she was watching but not ready to solve yet. What she noticed instead, with the steady methodical attention she applied to everything, was that Adrian Voss was exhausted. Not in a visible way. He was too controlled for visible exhaustion and too proud. And the particular kind of ambition that builds a $2 billion enterprise tends to train itself out of the habit of letting tiredness show. But she could see it in the decisions, small decisions, the ones that didn't have strategic weight, where the quality of judgment degraded in ways she could only see because she was watching everything. Shorter response times, less pushback on the 2nd and 3rd option, a slight flattening of the incisive questioning that was normally his signature. He was carrying everything. Not just the big things, the acquisitions, the strategic direction, the board relationships, the medium things and the small things too, the layers of operational detail that should have been held by other people, but that he couldn't fully release because releasing things required trust, and trust required a track record. And building track records took time. He didn't stop long enough to invest. She put it in a weekly report, buried in the middle of a section about resource allocation. The current distribution of decision-making authority creates concentration risk at the executive level. When key judgment is centralized in a single decision-maker across too many domains, organizational resilience declines. Recommend a formal authority matrix review. He didn't respond to it in writing. He didn't bring it up in their Tuesday meeting. 3 days later, he called her on her office phone at 7:45 in the morning before most people had arrived. "The authority matrix review," he said. No preamble. "What does that look like in practice?" "I start by mapping every decision that crosses your desk in a 2-week period and categorize it by whether it actually requires your authority or was routed to you by habit or because nobody else has been given permission to make it." A pause. "That's going to show that I'm involved in things I shouldn't be involved in." "Very likely." "And you want to tell me that?" "I want the organization to be resilient. That means not building every critical path through one person, even if that person is exceptional at what they do." Silence. She could hear faintly the sounds of him in his office, papers maybe, or a chair. "People have tried to tell me versions of this before," he said. "How did it go?" "They wanted me to delegate so they could take the authority." "I don't want your authority," she said. "I want your organization to work when you're sick or unavailable or just having a bad day." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd gone too far. Not because the position was wrong, she was certain about the position, but because some things that are correct are too correct for the moment. "Start the mapping," he said, and hung up. She started the mapping. It took 3 weeks, and what it revealed was both less dramatic and more concerning than she'd expected. Less dramatic because most of the decision concentration was mundane. Adrian was the default approver for things that had no strategic significance simply because nobody had ever formally granted approval authority to anyone else. More concerning because the mundane decisions were crowding out the significant ones, and the cognitive load of routine authorizations was creating exactly the kind of decision fatigue that produced the small degradation she'd been tracking. When she presented the findings, she did it in writing first and waited for him to read it before they talked. He read it in 20 minutes. She knew because his response email arrived exactly 22 minutes after she sent the report. The response was 2 sentences. "This is worse than I thought. Come up at 10. At 10, he was standing when she arrived, which was unusual. He was almost always at his desk. He was at the window, looking at the city. "I built this to be mine," he said, still looking at the window. "Every piece of it. I know that's not how you're supposed to do it, but that's how it got built." She stood near the door because he wasn't looking at her, and she didn't want to crowd the room. "I know." "The control isn't ego." He turned. His face had something on it she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability, exactly. More like the frank acknowledgement of a structural flaw in something he'd designed himself. It was the only way to make it work at the start. And then it kept working, so I kept doing it. Until the organization got bigger than one person's capacity. Yes. She let that sit for a moment. The authority matrix will help. The redistribution won't happen overnight, and it won't be clean. But the alternative is that the concentration gets worse as the company grows, and at some point it becomes the single biggest risk factor. He looked at her. "You're not saying I should trust people more. I'm saying you should build systems that don't require you to be everywhere. Trust is a separate conversation." Something shifted in his expression. "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me about this problem in 3 years." She didn't know what to do with that, so she moved to the work. They spent the next 2 hours building the framework, going through the decision categories she'd mapped, and assigning rational approval authorities to each one. He pushed back on some of her suggested redistributions. Not defensively, she thought, but because he had specific concerns about specific people that weren't visible in her data, and some of the pushback was legitimate, and she incorporated it, and some wasn't, and she said so. He accepted more of her corrections in that 2 hours than she'd expected. When they finished and she was packing up her materials, he said, "Why do you do this?" She looked up. "The work? The way you do it. Most people, when they find problems in an organization, they protect the finding. They make it about themselves." She considered this. "I don't care about the finding. I care about the thing the finding points to." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and gray through the window behind him, and the office was very quiet. 3 months ago, I would have said there was nobody in this building I actually trusted," he said. She kept her face neutral. "And now?" He didn't answer. He turned back to his desk, but she was almost to the door when he said, quietly, to the papers in front of him, "Come to the board presentation Thursday. In the room, not outside." She stopped. The board presentation was not something forensic accountants attended. It was a closed meeting. Chairman, CFO, 2 senior VPs, and the board members themselves. It was the kind of room that communicated power through access and access through exclusion. "Why?" she said. He looked up. The almost smile again, the precursor. "Because I want someone in that room who will tell me if I'm wrong." She stood there for a moment, looking at him across the office. "I'll be there," she said. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood watching the numbers change, and thought about what she'd said to the recruiter 6 months ago about a job that had seemed at the time like a manageable risk. She was starting to understand that she'd badly miscalculated the magnitude of what she'd walked into, not the work. The work was exactly what she'd expected. Hard, consequential, the kind that mattered. What she hadn't calculated for was the man at the top of it. The way he listened. The way he changed, not loudly or dramatically, but with a kind of quiet, grinding adjustment, like a ship correcting course, slow enough that you might not notice it in any given moment, fast enough that 3 months from now you'd look back and realize you were somewhere entirely different from where you started. She hadn't calculated for the possibility that the most feared person in the building might turn out to be, under the control and the silence and the reputation that preceded him into every room, someone in genuine need of the one thing she was very good at providing. The truth. The elevator came. She stepped in. And on the 43rd floor, in the Thursday board presentation she hadn't been told the full contents of, something was building that she didn't know about yet. A piece of information that one of the men in that room was carrying carefully, like a grenade with the pin already loose, waiting for exactly the right moment to use it. She would find out Thursday. She would wish, briefly, that she hadn't. Thursday came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the city look like a photograph of itself rather than the real thing. All the right shapes, none of the warmth. Elara was on the 43rd floor by 7:50, 45 minutes before the board presentation was scheduled to begin, because she needed to read the full deck before she sat in that room. Adrian had sent it to her the night before at 11:40, which told her something about when he'd finished preparing it and something about the fact that he'd thought of sending it to her at all. She read it twice. The first time for content, the second time for the things that weren't there. There was a section on the proposed Caldwell Group acquisition, a regional infrastructure company that the consortium had been in preliminary talks with for 6 weeks, and that Adrian was apparently ready to present to the board as a formal recommendation. The financial modeling was solid, the strategic rationale was well constructed, and the due diligence summary referenced an independent assessment completed by a firm called Mercer Ballard. She didn't recognize Mercer Ballard. She searched the name on her computer at 7:22 in the morning and found a firm that had been incorporated 14 months ago, with 4 employees listed in the registration documents, and a website that had the right vocabulary and none of the substance. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled up the Caldwell Group's last 3 years of publicly available financials and started reading. By 8:40, she had enough. The board members began arriving at 8:50. She watched them through the glass wall of the conference room as she sat in the small anteroom outside, where Adrian had told her to wait until he brought her in. 6 of them, ranging from a retired infrastructure executive in his 70s who moved like someone who'd been in rooms like this his entire life, to a woman in her late 40s named Carla Mendez, who ran a technology investment fund and who Elara had read enough about to know was sharp in the specific way that made other people in boards nervous. Gerald Holt arrived at 8:58, saw her through the glass, and stopped. He came to the anteroom door. "You're here for the board meeting." "Yes." He looked at her with the complicated expression he'd worn since their conversation in her office. Neither hostile nor comfortable, something in between that she'd started to think of as his honest face. "Adrian told you to be here." "Yes." He processed this. She could see him filing it in whatever mental model he'd been building of her and of the way things were shifting around him. "Is there a problem with the Caldwell presentation?" It wasn't entirely a question. He knew her well enough by now to understand that her presence in an anteroom before a board meeting meant she'd found something. "There may be a question about the Mercer Ballard assessment," she said. Something moved across his face. Fast and then gone. "I commissioned that assessment." She looked at him. "I know." The silence between them had a specific texture, the texture of 2 people who have been professionally honest with each other standing at the edge of something that honesty was going to make significantly more complicated. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet. I need to see the full assessment document, not just the summary in the deck." He reached into the folder under his arm, which was thicker than the board presentation deck she'd received. He pulled out a bound document, 40 pages, maybe 50, and held it out to her. She took it, looked at him. "You brought the full document." "I was going to give it to him before the meeting." A pause. "I was still deciding." She looked at the document in her hands, then at him. "Go in," she said. "I'll find you afterward." He stood there for another moment, and she could see the machinery working behind his face, the calculation of risks, the measurement of costs, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy and hasn't decided yet whether to put it down or keep going. He went in. She opened the document. She read fast, the kind of fast that comes from years of training yourself to extract signal from noise at volume. And what she found, page by page, was not fraud. Not quite. What it was a compound of selective presentation and aggressive assumption that added up in the final valuation figure to a number that was approximately 22% higher than the most optimistic supportable estimate she could build from the underlying data. Mercer Ballard had been paid to find a number. They had found it, and Gerald Holt had commissioned them. At 9:03, the door to the conference room opened and Adrian looked out. He registered her expression. She knew her face, knew it was controlled, knew that the control itself was information to someone who'd been watching her for 3 months. "Come in," he said. She came in. The 6 board members tracked her entry with the particular attention of people who are accustomed to knowing everyone in the rooms they enter. Carla Mendez's gaze was the sharpest. A quick assessment, the kind that doesn't look like it's happening until you notice it's already over. Adrian introduced her without ceremony. "Elara Whitmore, Forensic Accounting. She's been reviewing our financial infrastructure for the past quarter." He moved back to the head of the table. "I asked her to be present today." A board member named Hoffman, the retired infrastructure executive, looked at her with the measured neutrality of someone who had decided nothing yet. "In what capacity?" "In the capacity of someone who reads documents," she said. A small silence. Carla Mendez almost smiled. The presentation began. She sat along the wall rather than at the table, which was where she wanted to be. Observer's position, enough distance to watch the whole room rather than just the person speaking. Adrian walked through the Caldwell acquisition case with the fluency of someone who'd built the argument himself and believed it. The strategic rationale was genuinely strong. She didn't doubt that part. The board was engaged, asking the right questions. Carla Mendez pressing on market position, and Hoffman asking about infrastructure liability timelines. It was going well, and then Hoffman asked about the independent assessment. "Mercer Ballard completed a full valuation in September," Adrian said. "The summary's in your packet, page 11. Their independent figure supports the acquisition price with approximately 8% upside potential." "I'm not familiar with Mercer Ballard," Carla said. "How long have they been doing this work?" A beat, barely perceptible. "Gerald?" He looked at his CFO. "You engaged them." Gerald was looking at the table. 1 second, 2. 14 months, he said. "They're a newer firm, strong technical capabilities." "Newer meaning they've done how many independent assessments of this type?" Another pause. Longer this time. Elara looked at Adrian. He hadn't looked at her yet, but she could see in the set of his shoulders that he was registering the pauses, registering the texture of what was happening in the room, and beginning to understand that something was wrong. "Gerald," Carla said, and her voice had changed. Not harder exactly, more precise, the way a knife is more precise than a hammer. "How many assessments of this type has Mercer Ballard completed?" "This is their first infrastructure acquisition assessment of this scale," Gerald said. The room absorbed that. Adrian was looking at his CFO now. She could see his face in profile. The jaw, the controlled stillness that she'd learned was where his anger lived when it wasn't ready to become words yet. "And the valuation methodology," Carla continued. "Did anyone review it independently?" Silence. Elara said, "I reviewed the full assessment document this morning." Everyone looked at her. She'd thought on the walk from the anteroom to her seat along the wall about how to do this. Not whether. There was never a question about whether. But how? And she'd decided that the how was the same as it always was. Directly, without softening that served no one, but also without the kind of bluntness that turns a factual correction into a spectacle. "The methodology is technically sound in its framework," she said. "The problem is in the input assumptions. 3 of the key variables, projected infrastructure maintenance costs, regional regulatory compliance timeline, and depreciation schedule for the primary asset class, are modeled at values that sit at the outer edge of the optimistic range without sufficient justification for why the outer edge is the right estimate. She paused. The cumulative effect of those three assumptions on the final valuation is significant. How significant? Hoffman said. The number in your packet is approximately 22% higher than what I'd consider a defensible central estimate. The room was very quiet. Carla Mendez set down her pen. That's not 8% upside, that's 22% downside. From a defensible central estimate, yes. Adrian's voice, when it came, was so level it was almost without pitch. What's the acquisition price relative to a corrected valuation? At corrected central estimate, you're paying a 17% premium with no structural basis for it. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. She could feel it pressing against the walls. Adrian turned to Gerald. Gerald was looking at the table with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the complicated, honest look he'd developed for her, but something stripped of everything except the bare fact of what was happening. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like someone who was very tired and had no way left to put it down. "Gerald," Adrian said. One word, nothing else. Gerald looked up. "I commissioned Mercer Ballard because the standard firms were coming in with valuations that didn't support the deal." The room absorbed that. Carla Mendez sat very still. "The deal you recommended," Adrian said. "Yes. And you chose a firm that would give you the number you needed. I chose a firm I believed would look at the opportunity with fresh eyes." A pause. "I knew what I was doing. I knew what it was." The air in the room had a quality she associated with the moments just before things break. A surface tension, everything balanced on the edge of the next thing. Adrian stood up. She watched him do it, the controlled, deliberate movement of someone who is managing something very large inside themselves with a very tight grip. "We're going to recess," he said to the board. 30 minutes. I'll ask you to stay." He looked at Gerald. "My office. Now." He looked at Elara last. A quick look, very direct. Something in it she couldn't fully read. Not blame, she was certain of that. Something more complicated. Acknowledgement, maybe. The particular acknowledgement of someone who has just had a thing confirmed that they had been choosing, on some level, not to look at. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. He walked out. Gerald followed him, and the way he walked, the particular quality of a person who knows exactly where they're going and has accepted it, made something in her chest do a thing she didn't have a name for. The board members held the silence for a moment after the door closed. Then Hoffman said to no one in particular, "Well," Carla looked at Elara. "How long have you been here?" 3 months. "And the Hartwell error, that was you?" "Yes." Carla looked at the closed door. "Does he know what he has in you?" Elara considered the question, which was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. "We're working on it," she said. The 30 minutes stretched. She stayed in the room because she hadn't been told to leave and because she thought Carla Mendez might want to talk. And Carla did. A careful, specific conversation about the consortium's overall financial governance that felt less like small talk and more like a quiet audit of its own, which Elara respected and answered honestly. When Adrian came back, he came back alone. He stood at the head of the table and looked at his board with the face of someone who had just put something down that he'd been carrying a long time. "Gerald Holt has tendered his resignation," he said. "I've accepted it. Effective immediately, Elara Whitmore will assume interim oversight of the financial functions pending a formal CFO search." He paused. "The Caldwell acquisition will be suspended pending a full independent reassessment by a firm selected by the board. If the reassessment supports the deal at a corrected valuation, we revisit. If it doesn't, we walk." He looked around the room. "I owe this board an apology. My oversight of the assessment process was insufficient. That won't happen again." Hoffman nodded slowly. Carla said nothing, which Elara was beginning to understand was Carla's version of assent. The meeting concluded within 15 minutes. She was the last one to leave because she moved slowly when she was processing things, and she had a great deal to process. Adrian was standing at the window again when she passed his office, door open, which was unusual, and she stopped in the hallway. He didn't turn around. "I want to be angry at you," he said. "I know." "I'm not." He turned. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. A structural tiredness, the kind that comes from something you've been managing revealing itself as unmanageable. I've known Gerald for 9 years. I know. He wasn't a bad person. He stopped. He wanted the deal. He believed in the deal. He found a way to make the numbers cooperate with what he believed. It happens, she said, especially when someone believes they're right. It shouldn't happen here. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. He looked at her steadily. You're going to tell me the process should have prevented it. The process should have prevented it. Something moved across his face. Not anger, or at least not at her. I put you in the room today because I wanted someone who would tell me if I was wrong. A pause. I didn't think it would be that wrong. I know. He turned back to the window. The city was still gray, still flat with the particular cold light of late morning. Interim CFO, he said. That's not a small thing. No. Are you telling me no? She stood there for a moment because this was a question worth taking seriously. The scope was larger than what she'd been hired for. The structural authority would create dynamics that didn't exist in her current role. She would be visible in a way she generally avoided, and visible in a specific company where visibility had just proven to be a liability for the person who'd held the role before her. She thought about all of that. I'm not telling you no, she said. I'm telling you I'll need the same thing I always need. Which is access, honesty. And for you to let me tell you when you're wrong without making it a referendum on your authority. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a bird crossed the gray sky and disappeared behind a building. You're going to find more things, he said, for the third time. Heard the same words, but different now. Not a prediction, more like an acknowledgement that they were standing at the beginning of something neither of them had fully mapped yet. Almost certainly, she said, for the third time. He nodded, very slightly. She was already in the hallway, almost to the elevator, when she heard him say, Whitmore. She stopped. The Caldwell deal. His voice carried clearly through the open door. I believed in it. I still think the strategic rationale is right. She turned back toward the doorway. The rationale might be right, the price isn't. If the reassessment comes back and supports a lower number, then you renegotiate, she said. Or you walk, depending on whether Caldwell will move. A pause. And if they won't move? She looked at him across the hallway. Then you walk, and you find the next one. He held that. She could see him weighing it against the 9 months of work on the deal, against the strategic vision he'd built around it, against the very human and very understandable resistance to letting go of something you've invested in. That's harder than it sounds, he said. I know, she said. Do it anyway. She took the elevator down. In her office, she sat for a long time without doing anything. The spreadsheet from the morning was still open on her screen, its neat columns undisturbed by everything that had happened in the 4 hours since she'd last looked at it. Gerald's office, 2 floors up, was presumably already being cleared. She thought about the document he'd handed her in the anteroom, the way he'd already had it in his folder, the way he'd said, with a flatness that held nothing back, I was going to give it to him before the meeting. I was still deciding. She thought about what it meant that he'd been deciding, that the decision hadn't been made until he saw her there. She opened her email and started drafting the interim CFFO transition plan, because someone had to, and it might as well be her, and there was no point in sitting with the weight of everything that had just happened when there was work that needed doing. She was 3 paragraphs in when her phone rang. Carla Mendez, board member, fund manager. The sharpest person in the room today by a margin, Elara had been quietly measuring. She answered. I'll keep this brief, Carla said. I've been on 6 boards. I have never seen what happened in that room today. Which part? Any of it. All of it. A pause. There are people on this board who are going to be watching you very carefully, Ms. Whitmore, not because they doubt your competence. Because they doubt my loyalties, Elara said. Because you've disrupted something that was comfortable for a significant number of people, and disruption makes people look for an angle. A pause. I'm calling to tell you that I don't think you have an angle. and I think that's going to be a problem for you in ways you may not have anticipated." Elara was quiet, turning this over. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where someone with real power decides the most efficient solution is to make you the problem rather than the solution." A beat. "There's a man named Harlan Cross. He sits on the Acquisitions Advisory Committee. He wasn't in the room today, but he will hear about today, and he had a significant financial interest in the Caldwell deal moving forward." Elara wrote the name down. "How significant?" "Significant enough that a 17% valuation correction matters to him personally." Another pause. "I'm not telling you to be afraid of him. I'm telling you to know he exists." The call ended. Elara sat with the name on her notepad and the city going darker outside her window as the gray afternoon leaned toward evening, and thought about the particular way that doing the right thing tends to create its own set of consequences. Not neat, not proportional, not arranged in any order that resembles fairness. She thought about Adrian in his office upstairs, carrying the weight of a 9-year relationship that had just ended in 40 minutes. She thought about Gerald and the document he'd pulled from his folder and handed her, and the thing that had been in his face when he said, "I was still deciding." She picked up her pen and underlined the name, Harlan Cross. Then she went back to the transition plan, because there was work to do, and because the work was the only thing she fully trusted to be what it appeared to be, a problem with a solution, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She was still writing when the email arrived at 6:47 in the evening. It was from an address she didn't recognize. No subject line. The body was 4 sentences. "You should know that your hire was not unanimous. There are questions about your previous work at Aldridge and Park that were not surfaced during your background check. I thought you should have the opportunity to address them before someone else does. Consider this a courtesy." She read it 3 times. Then she closed her laptop, picked up her bag, and stood at her window for a moment looking at the city lights beginning to come on against the dark. Aldridge and Park. Her previous firm, 6 years of clean, documented, unimpeachable work. Whatever this was, it was not a courtesy. She didn't sleep, not because she was afraid. She'd examined that possibility carefully, the way she examined everything, turning it over and checking its edges. But because her mind had locked onto the email the way it locked onto a balance sheet with a wrong number, and it wouldn't release until it found the source of the discrepancy. Aldridge and Park. 6 years. She knew every audit she'd completed there, every finding she'd documented, every report she'd signed. She knew the work the way you know something you've built with your hands in low light, every joint and seam and load-bearing piece. There was nothing there that could be made into what that email implied, which meant the email wasn't about what was actually there. It was about what someone could make look like it was there. She was at her desk by 6 in the morning, before the building had its daytime population, in the particular quiet of a large office that hasn't woken up yet. She pulled her personnel file. She had access to it as interim CFO, a fact she was now grateful for, and read through her own background check documentation with the specific attention of someone looking for what was missing rather than what was present. The check was thorough. Standard for the consortium's executive hires, which meant it was more thorough than most. Employment verification, credential confirmation, reference checks, a financial background review, and a professional conduct inquiry that included a formal request to Aldridge and Park's compliance office. The compliance office response was in the file. 3 paragraphs, clean. She read it twice, then read it a third time, looking specifically at the language, the precise, careful language of a document written by someone in a legal or compliance function who chooses words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. On the third read, she found it. Not an absence, a presence, a single phrase in the second paragraph that didn't belong in a standard employment verification response. To our knowledge and within the scope of records available to this office. Standard compliance responses didn't hedge like that. Standard responses either confirmed or declined. The hedge was a tell, the language of someone who knew something they weren't including and was carefully protecting themselves against the future moment when the something became visible. She picked up her phone and called the main number for Aldridge and Park at 6:17 in the morning, knowing she'd get voicemail, and left a message for the compliance director asking for a callback at the earliest possible time. Then she sat back and thought about Harlan Cross. She'd spent 2 hours the previous night building what she could from public records: board appointments, corporate filings, press mentions, the thin public profile of a man who had apparently made a significant effort to remain less visible than his financial footprint warranted. He was on the Acquisitions Advisory Committee of the Voss Consortium, appointed 14 months ago, which was the same period in which Mercer Ballard had been incorporated. She didn't have enough to draw a line between those two facts yet, but the proximity was the kind of thing her instincts had learned to mark and return to. He had financial interests in at least 6 infrastructure-adjacent businesses, 2 of which would have benefited materially from the Caldwell acquisition going through at the proposed price. Not as the seller, more obliquely than that, through positions in related markets that would have moved in predictable directions if the deal had closed on the original terms. Not illegal, necessarily, but the kind of interest that turned a disrupted acquisition into a personal financial problem, the kind of problem that motivated anonymous emails. At 8:45, Adrian arrived. She knew because she heard the elevator and the specific sound of his footsteps in the hallway. She'd learned them the way you learn sounds in a building you spend too much time in. And then he appeared in her doorway, looking like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was to say not much. He looked at her desk, the files spread across it, the notepad with Harlan Cross's name and what she'd built around it, the printed copy of the compliance response with the hedged sentence underlined. "You've been here since 6, he said. 6:03. He came in without being invited, which he'd started doing at some point in the past month, and sat down across from her. He looked at the notepad. Harlan Cross. Carla Mendez called me after the board meeting. She told me he had a financial interest in Caldwell going through. I know about his interest. She looked at him. You knew. I knew he had positions that would benefit from the deal. That's not unusual for advisory committee members. They're chosen partly because they have skin in the relevant sectors. Did you know the skin was significant enough that a failed deal would hurt him personally? A pause. I knew it was meaningful. She held it carefully. Last night, I received an anonymous email suggesting there were questions about my previous work at my prior firm that weren't surfaced in my background check. His face changed. Not dramatically. He didn't do dramatic. But something behind his eyes went very still. Show me, he said. She turned her laptop to face him. He read it again, set the laptop back on her desk with a deliberateness that meant he was managing something. Aldridge and Park, he said. I left clean. I know my own work. I know you do. His voice was flat in a way that wasn't directed at her. When did this arrive? 6:47 last night. You didn't call me. It was 6:47 at night and I didn't have enough information yet. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you now. He stood up, moved to the window, the small window in her office that looked at the parking structure, not the city, which she'd never bothered to mind. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Harlan Cross, he said again. Not a question this time. I don't have a line yet. I have proximity. What do you need? Access to the advisory committee appointment records and any communication between the committee and Gerald Holt during the Caldwell due diligence period. He turned around. Gerald's access has been revoked. I know. I need the communication records, not Gerald, whatever went through the consortium's internal system. A pause. I'll have IT unlock those records for you by 9:30. He left. She went back to the files. The compliance director from Aldridge and Park called at 9:08. Her name was Sandra Cho, and she had the careful voice of someone who had been expecting this call and had decided in advance how much to say. Ms. Whitmore, thank you for reaching out. I'll be direct, Elara said. I reviewed the background check response your office provided to the Voss Consortium. The language in the second paragraph is non-standard. I'd like to understand why. A short silence. Background check responses are confidential documents. I'm the subject of the document, and I'm currently serving in an executive function at the Voss Consortium that is likely to attract scrutiny. If there's something in your firm's records that someone is planning to use against me, I need to know what it is. Another silence. Longer. Ms. Whitmore, I'm not in a position to discuss Sandra. She kept her voice level. Someone sent me an anonymous email last night implying that there are questions about my work at your firm that weren't surfaced during the background check. I have a hedged sentence in your compliance response that suggests you know what those questions are. I'm asking you directly to tell me what I'm dealing with. The silence this time was different. She could hear Sandra Cho doing the same calculation she'd been doing all morning. The cost of talking versus the cost of not talking, measured against the specific weight of what she apparently knew. There was an internal inquiry, Sandra said finally, 18 months ago. It was closed without findings. An inquiry into what? A client alleged that audit findings from a report you completed had been altered before final delivery. The allegation was investigated and determined to be without merit. The client withdrew the complaint. Elara's hand, resting on her desk, went very still. "Which client?" she said. A pause. "I'm not able to share that." Was the client's name Harlan Cross, or a company associated with Harlan Cross? The silence that followed was its own answer. "The inquiry was closed without findings," Sandra said again, carefully. "I know, thank you." She ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hand flat on the desk and her breathing very even, and the specific cold clarity that comes when a thing you've been tracking resolves into its actual shape. An audit she'd completed at Aldridge and Park. A client who'd alleged the findings had been altered. An inquiry that had been, what? Withdrawn? Resolved? And now, 18 months later, an anonymous email implying the questions hadn't actually been answered. She pulled up her records from Aldridge and Park. She still had them. She kept everything. It was a habit she'd developed early and never broken. She searched by the time frame, 18 months back, plus some buffer, and found the audit in question in 4 minutes. Crestfield Properties, a regional real estate development company. She'd audited their partnership structure in preparation for a capital raise and found a liability classification issue that had materially overstated the net asset value available to prospective investors. She'd reported it. Crestfield had pushed back hard through their legal team. She'd held the finding. Aldridge and Park's senior partner, a man named Robert Lyle, who had a long and comfortable relationship with Crestfield's principals, had asked her twice to reconsider the classification. She hadn't reconsidered. The audit had been finalized with the finding intact. Crestfield had not completed the capital raise on the original terms. She had assumed that was the end of it. She pulled up the public records for Crestfield Properties and started reading, and what she found, building layer by layer over the next 40 minutes, was a corporate family tree with roots that went somewhere she hadn't expected. Crestfield Properties. Parent company. Aldgate Capital Group, primary investor in Aldgate Capital Group, through 2 intermediary structures, a fund managed by an infrastructure investment vehicle called Cross Meridian Partners. Cross Meridian Partners. Harlan Cross. She sat back in her chair. He'd been the money behind Crestfield. Her audit finding had killed their capital raise, which had cost him, she ran the numbers quickly from the available records, somewhere between $8 and $12 million in projected returns. 18 months ago, he tried to deal with it by alleging her findings had been altered. The inquiry had failed because the findings hadn't been altered, and she had documentation for every step. So he'd waited. He'd gotten himself onto the Voss Consortium's advisory committee 14 months ago, 4 months after the inquiry was closed, and he'd waited for an opportunity. Gerald Holt and the Caldwell acquisition had given him one. She didn't know yet whether he'd manufactured the opportunity or simply recognized it when it appeared. Either way, when the deal collapsed yesterday, she had handed him a reason to come back to the question he'd never finished asking. She was building the full picture when Adrian appeared in her doorway again. He looked at her face and stopped. "What?" he said. She told him. All of it, in order, without editorializing, the way she always did. Crestfield. The inquiry. The corporate structure. The connection to Cross Meridian Partners. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's been on my advisory committee for 14 months, he said. "Yes. And his interest in Caldwell was partly about the deal itself and partly, I think, about creating a position from which to manage me." The word manage landed in the room with its full weight. He needed you out, Adrian said. Not a question. If I'm not here, the Caldwell reassessment gets handled by whoever replaces me, and whoever replaces me doesn't have the same reason I have to look closely at Cross Meridian's adjacent positions. She paused, and without the Hartwell correction, without the due diligence process changes, without everything I've been doing here for 3 months, the original deal probably goes through. Adrian's jaw was tight. And Gerald? I don't think Gerald knew about Cross's history with me. I think Gerald wanted the deal and was predisposed to work with whoever made the deal easier. She looked at him directly. Gerald made his own choices. But I think he was also being managed by someone who had a reason to manage him. The quiet in the room was different from the usual kind. It had a direction to it. I have to remove him from the committee, Adrian said. You need to be careful about how you do it. If he knows you're moving on him before you have the full picture, you lose the ability to understand the full scope. What's the full scope? I don't know yet. I know he tried to corrupt an audit 18 months ago. I know he has positions that were affected by Caldwell falling through. I don't know yet whether there's a broader pattern. She looked at her notepad. I need 2 more days. He looked at her steadily. 2 days. To build what I can build from the internal records and the public filings. After that, you'll need legal involved and possibly external investigators. And in the meantime, he's still on the committee. In the meantime, he doesn't know what I know. That's an advantage. Don't give it up early. He held her gaze for a moment. You're asking me to sit across from him in a room and not... Yes. Another long pause. You're remarkably comfortable asking difficult things. I'm comfortable asking necessary things, she said. The difficulty is incidental. Something moved across his face. 2 days, he said. Then I want everything on my desk. He left. She went back to work. The internal communication records came through from IT at 10:15. She started reading, and what she found in the first hour confirmed things she'd suspected and introduced things she hadn't anticipated. There were 11 communications between Harlan Cross and Gerald Holt during the Caldwell due diligence period, routed through the advisory committee's formal channel, which meant they were technically proper in form even if what was being communicated wasn't. Cross had recommended Mercer Ballard. Directly, in writing, in the second of the 11 communications, framed as a suggestion from a committee member with relevant sector experience. Gerald had accepted the recommendation without flagging it to Adrian, which was either professional negligence or something more deliberate, and she was no longer certain which. She was building a timeline from the communications when her office door opened without a knock. She looked up. The man in the doorway was someone she hadn't seen before. Late 50s, well-dressed in the understated way that means the money is old enough not to need announcing, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where stillness is a form of power. She knew who he was before he spoke, because she'd spent 2 days reading about him, and because he had a quality she'd described to herself last night as purposeful visibility. The decision to be seen, here, now, in this specific doorway, was not accidental. Ms. Whitmore, Harlan Cross said. I hope I'm not interrupting. She set down her pen. Mr. Cross? He came in, looked at the files on her desk with the careful non-reaction of someone who has already decided what they're seeing doesn't concern them. Sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which was a different gesture than when Adrian did it. Adrian sat in her chairs because the work required proximity. This man sat in her chair because sitting in it was a statement about who had the authority to sit where. I heard about Gerald, he said. Terrible situation. It was. You were in the board meeting. I was. That must have been difficult. His voice had a quality, smooth, calibrated, with an undercurrent she could feel but not quite name. Presenting findings that affected a colleague's career. I presented findings that were accurate, she said. What happened after that was Gerald's own doing. He looked at her with an expression of mild sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. Of course. A pause. I wanted to introduce myself in person. As a committee member, I think it's important that we have a direct relationship, particularly given your new interim role. I appreciate that. I also wanted to say, He paused, in the way that means the pause is the message. I've heard a little about your background, Aldridge and Park. You did good work there, from what I understand. Her hands were flat on the desk. She kept them flat. Thank you. Though I recall there was some kind of inquiry at some point, something about an audit. She looked at him directly, said nothing. He held the eye contact with the practiced ease of someone who has used silence as a weapon for long enough that he's forgotten it's a choice. These things happen, I suppose. Audit work is complicated. Clients can be difficult. A slight tilt of his head. It would be unfortunate if something like that resurfaced at a moment when you're taking on significant new responsibilities. Is there something specific you'd like to say to me, Mr. Cross? He smiled. It was a complete smile, involving all the right muscles, producing all the right shapes. I just wanted to offer my support, he said. The transition is going to be complicated. I've been on this committee long enough to understand how the consortium works, and I'd be glad to be a resource for you as you find your footing. She held his gaze for a long moment. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'll keep it in mind. He stood, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back in the way that is designed to look casual. One more thing, he said. The Caldwell reassessment. I imagine you'll be overseeing the firm selection. I will. I'd recommend taking your time with it. These things can be rushed, and when they're rushed, findings tend to be less nuanced than they might otherwise be. She kept her face completely neutral. I'll take exactly the time that's needed. He looked at her for one more moment. The smile again, smaller this time, more real in its smallness. I'm sure you will, he said, and left. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds after he was gone. Then she picked up her phone and called Adrian. He came to my office, she said when he answered. A pause. When? 5 minutes ago. He didn't say anything explicit. He referenced the Aldridge inquiry. He suggested I take my time with the Caldwell reassessment. The silence on the line was the controlled kind. He's warning you off. He's establishing that he knows things and is willing to use them. It's a preliminary move. She paused. It means I don't have 2 days. How long do you have? However long it takes him to decide that a conversation wasn't enough. She looked at the files on her desk. I need to move tonight. What do you need? I need you to get me into the full advisory committee appointment records, not just the communication logs. The original appointment documentation, the recommendation that put him on the committee, and any disclosures he filed when he was appointed. That's legal's territory. I know. Get me legal. A pause. I'll call Marcus. He can have someone there in an hour. Marcus Reeve was the consortium's general counsel. She'd met him twice, briefly, and formed the impression of someone who was very good at his job and very aware of it. There's something else, she said. Tell me. The anonymous email. The Aldridge inquiry. His positions in Crestfield through Cross Meridian. The Mercer Ballard recommendation to Gerald. She organized it in her mind the way she organized everything, by load-bearing structure. Individually, each of these is ambiguous. Together, they form a pattern. But a pattern isn't proof. What does proof look like? Financial records from Cross Meridian that show the Crestfield positions and their relationship to the failed capital raise. Communication records that connect him to the anonymous email. And ideally, she stopped. Elara. She almost didn't register it. He'd used her first name exactly once before in passing and had returned to Whitmore immediately after, and she'd noted it and filed it in the category of things she was watching but not interpreting yet. Ideally, she said, something that connects him to the original Crestfield audit complaint. If he filed a formal allegation with Aldridge, there's documentation. If that documentation can be compared to his Cross Meridian positions at the time, it establishes motive. It establishes a pattern of using professional complaint processes as a financial weapon, she said, which is a specific and serious thing. He was quiet. She could hear him in his office, the sounds of a person in motion. I'm coming down, he said. You don't need to. I'm coming down. He hung up. She sat for a moment looking at the files on her desk, at the name on her notepad, at the printed email with its 4 careful sentences. Then she pulled up the Crestfield audit file and started building the evidentiary timeline. Because if Harlan Cross had decided that the conversation in her office this morning was a first move, she needed to be several moves ahead before he made his second. Adrian arrived 8 minutes later with his jacket off and his sleeves pushed up, which she had learned was what he looked like when he'd stopped performing control and was actually using it. He sat across from her and looked at the timeline she'd started building on the whiteboard she'd pulled from the corner. "Walk me through it," he said. She walked him through it. All of it. In order. Every piece she had and every gap where pieces were missing. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption until she was done, and then with the specific load-bearing questions that told her he'd tracked every step. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been positioning for this since before he got on the committee," he said. "That's what the timeline suggests. He got onto my committee specifically to manage exposure from the Crestfield situation. And when Caldwell gave him an opportunity to both profit and neutralize me simultaneously, he took it." Adrian stood up, moved to the whiteboard, looked at the timeline. "If the legal review confirms the pattern," he said, "he's exposed on at least 3 separate fronts: the complaint filing, the Mercer-Ballard recommendation, the anonymous communication. Potentially, I need the documentation before I know how solid each piece is." He turned around. His face had a quality she'd seen once before, in his office after the board meeting, when he'd looked at the window and talked about the empire he'd built and the control he'd used to build it. That same frank acknowledgement of a structural problem, but harder now, more specific in its anger. "He used my committee," Adrian said. "He used my organization to protect himself from consequences that were legitimate. Yes. And he used Gerald to do it." "Gerald made his own choices," she said again. "But yes." He looked at the whiteboard for another moment. Then he looked at her. "Marcus is going to ask why you're the one who built this," he said. "He's going to ask what your relationship is to the Crestfield situation." "I know." "He's going to point out that you have a personal interest in the outcome." "I have a professional interest in accurate information and an organizational interest in removing a compromised committee member," she said. "Those are the interests I can document. The personal dimensions are real, but they don't change the evidence." "No," he said, "they don't." A pause. "But they give him a way to attack the findings." She held that. Because it was true, and because it was the part she'd been circling since this morning. The specific vulnerability of being both the person who found the problem and a subject of the problem. "Then I need to make sure the documentation is airtight enough that the attack fails," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's going to require you to be completely transparent about the Crestfield history. Everything, including the parts where Aldridge pushed back on your findings and you held." "I know." "Including the fact that your position cost him money." "I know." "And you're comfortable with that." She thought about what comfortable meant in this context. She thought about the specific discomfort of exposing a record that was clean, but would be made to look complicated in front of lawyers and board members and whatever external investigators ended up involved, knowing that Cross and whoever was working with him would use every piece of that exposure as material for an alternative narrative. "I'm not comfortable with it," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." Something in his face, not quite the almost smile, something more serious than that, more weighted. "Whitmore," he said. "What?" "I need you to understand something." He moved away from the whiteboard toward her desk and stood across it from her with his hands flat on the surface in a mirror of her own posture. "When this becomes public, and it will become public, there are going to be people who look at the fact that you uncovered evidence against a man who previously tried to damage your career and conclude that this is personal, that you built this case to protect yourself. I know. And the only thing that protects you from that narrative is the quality of the evidence. I know that too. So I need to ask you directly." His eyes were steady on hers. "Is there anything in this case that you've built because you needed it to be there? Anything where the connection is thinner than you're presenting it?" She held his gaze. The room was very quiet. "No," she said. He held the eye contact for 3 seconds. 4. 5. "Okay," he said. He believed her. She could see it. Not the naive belief of someone who trusts easily, but the specific earned belief of someone who has watched a person work long enough to understand how they think. She picked up her pen. "Then let's build the case," she said. Marcus Reeve arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a junior attorney named Priya who took notes and asked precise questions and reminded Elara of herself at 28, which was mildly unsettling. Marcus listened to the full presentation with his hands folded and his face professionally neutral, asking nothing until she was done. Then he said, "You understand that if we move on Cross, he will immediately counter by surfacing the Aldridge inquiry." "I understand, and you're prepared for that to become the public narrative for some period of time, regardless of the eventual outcome." "I'm prepared for the evidence to be the public narrative." Marcus looked at her, then at Adrian, then back at her. "You have good instincts," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more like the acknowledgement of a fact he wished were less complicated. They spent 3 hours building the formal case structure, what they had, what they needed, what the investigative steps looked like, and how to sequence the removal of Cross from the committee in a way that didn't alert him before the documentation was complete. At 5:30, Marcus closed his notebook. "I need 48 hours to run down the cross-meridian financial records through proper channels. Can you hold the committee position for 48 hours? "Cross came to her office this morning," Adrian said. We're operating on his timeline, not ours." "Then I'll make it 36. Priya was already calling someone as she walked out. Marcus paused in the doorway. "Ms. Whitmore, the Crestfield audit documentation. Every version, every communication, every piece of back and forth with Aldridge's senior partner." He looked at her with the specific look of a lawyer who is managing someone else's exposure and needs them to understand the stakes. "Everything." "I'll have it to you by 7 tonight, she said. He left. The office was quiet again. Adrian hadn't left yet. She became aware of that as she turned back to her desk, aware of him standing near the door in the particular stillness of someone who is about to say something they've been deciding whether to say. "Whitmore." She looked up. "When this is over," he said, and then stopped, started again. "When this is over, I want to have a different kind of conversation." She held that. "About what?" He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd been watching evolve over 3 months, from measurement to something like cautious recognition to this, something that was neither comfortable nor simple, but was very specific. "About what we're actually doing here," he said. "What this is." She didn't know what to say to that, which was an unusual enough experience that she registered it. 36 hours, she said finally. 36 hours, he said. He left. She turned back to her desk and started pulling the Crestfield files, every version, every email, every margin note from every review, the full, unedited record of the work she'd done and the fight she'd had to do it, and the cost she hadn't known she was paying until it arrived 18 months later in the form of a man in her doorway with a careful smile and a threat wrapped in the language of support. She was 2 hours into the compilation when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, older, with the flat effect of someone reading from something rather than speaking naturally. "Miss Whitmore, you should know that the Crestfield audit documentation in Robert Lyle's possession is different from the version in yours." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Different how?" she said. "The final delivery version has 3 findings modified from your original draft. Lyle made the changes after you signed off." A pause. "Cross has had a copy of the modified version for 14 months. He's been waiting for the right moment to put them side by side and ask why they're different." The floor of everything she'd built in the last 12 hours shifted underneath her. "Who are you?" she said. The line went dead. She set the phone down on her desk with great care, the way you set down something fragile when your hands aren't entirely steady, and sat very still in the quiet office while the full shape of what she was now facing assembled itself with the merciless clarity of a balance sheet that will not, no matter how many times you check it, add up to the number you need. She didn't move for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because the clock on her desk was directly in her line of sight, and she watched the digits change without seeing them, the way you watch something while your mind is somewhere else entirely, processing a thing that is too large to process all at once, and so breaks it into pieces and examines each piece separately until the whole becomes visible. Robert Lyle had altered the Crestfield audit findings after she signed off, which meant there existed a version of her work in official Aldridge and Park records that didn't match what she'd actually written, which meant that when Cross put the two versions side by side, and he would, the anonymous caller had told her he already had the modified version, had been holding it for 14 months like a card you keep until the hand is worth playing. The story it told was that she had either falsified her original findings or agreed to changes she was now pretending not to know about. Neither story was survivable in the current climate. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Reeve. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was still at the building. "Whitmore." "I have a problem," she said. "I need you back in my office." A pause. "How bad?" "Bad enough that 36 hours may not be the relevant timeline anymore." He was there in 8 minutes. She told him. Watched his face do the thing that lawyers' faces do when they receive information that restructures the case they've been building. A very controlled, very rapid reorganization, professional neutrality stretched across something that was actually alarm. "You need the original draft," he said when she finished. "I know. The version you actually wrote with timestamp documentation that predates any modification." "I know." She was already at her computer. "I draft everything in a personal document system before I transfer it to client-facing formats. I've done it since my second year. Compulsive habit. Tell me you still have the Crestfield draft." "I'm looking." The files were organized by year and client, her own private archive kept on an encrypted external drive she'd brought with her when she left Aldridge and Park because it was her work and her documentation, and she'd never considered that she'd need it as evidence of her own integrity. She found the Crestfield folder in 40 seconds, opened it. The original draft was there, dated, time-stamped, with her revision notes in the margins and the 3 findings that had apparently been modified in the delivery version sitting exactly where she'd put them in the language she'd written, unaltered. She turned the laptop to face Marcus. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said, "Email that to me right now, then to a personal account that has nothing to do with the consortium's servers. Then print 3 copies." She did all 3 while he stood there. "This is your foundation," he said. "With this and the metadata, you can establish that the original findings were yours, that they predate any modification, and that the delivery version was altered without your knowledge." He paused. "It doesn't prove Lyle made the changes, but it proves you didn't." "It proves I didn't agree to them," she said, "which is what Cross is going to allege." "Yes." He took one of the printed copies, folded it, put it inside his jacket. "I'm calling in external counsel tonight. This is beyond internal." "Cross has had 14 months to prepare his version of this story," she said. "How long do we have before he decides to use it?" Marcus looked at her. "He came to your office this morning. If he was going to wait, he would have kept waiting." He paused. "He came because yesterday rattled him. Rattled people do things on compressed timelines. So we have hours, possibly, a day at most." She nodded. The nod felt like something physical, like a decision that involved her whole body settling into a position. "Get me Adrian," she said. Marcus was already calling someone as he walked out. She stood up, took the remaining 2 printed copies of the draft, put one in her bag and one in the locked drawer of her desk, and stood for a moment looking at the city through her small window that faced the parking structure. Then she picked up her phone and called Adrian herself. He answered before the first ring finished. "What happened?" She told him. All of it, in 45 seconds, because there wasn't time for anything longer. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. "I'm coming down." "No, I'm coming up. I need the boardroom." Another pause. "Why the boardroom?" "Because if Cross moves tonight, I want to be in the room where I have the best chance of controlling what happens. And I want you to call Carla Mendez." "Carla. She warned me about Cross. She'll come." A beat. "I need someone on that board who already understands what's happening." The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll make the calls." She took the elevator up. The 43rd floor at 8:15 in the evening had a completely different character from its daytime self. The lights lower, the ambient noise gone, the space reduced to its essential geometry. She walked past the empty assistants' stations and the darkened offices and into the boardroom, where Adrian was already standing at the window with his phone in his hand and his jacket still on, which meant he hadn't been home yet either. He looked at her when she came in, just looked for a moment without saying anything. "You're steady," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Something moved across his face. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, not his usual chair, the one at the opposite end, and held it. She sat. He sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the empty table in the low evening light. "Lyle altered your findings," he said. "The anonymous caller said 3 findings were modified. The draft I have shows what the original language was. If I'm right about which 3, the modifications collectively reduce the severity of the liability classification enough that the net asset value comes back inside an acceptable range for a capital raise. Meaning the modified version of your audit would have supported the Crestfield deal." "Yes. And Cross has been holding the modified version for 14 months, with the intention of using it to suggest I falsified findings, changed my story, or agreed to changes I'm now denying." She kept her voice level. "Any of those narratives destroys my credibility, which destroys the Caldwell reassessment, which reopens the acquisition on the original terms." Adrian was quiet. The quiet had that weighted quality again. Direction to it, momentum. "He doesn't just want you discredited," he said. "He wants the deal. He's never stopped wanting the deal. Discrediting me is the mechanism." He stood up, moved to the window. She watched him think. The particular physical quality of it. The stillness that wasn't passive but active. A person running sequences. "Carla will be here in 20 minutes, he said. "Marcus is bringing external counsel. Priya is pulling Cross's full disclosure filings from the appointment records." He turned around. "I also called Gerald." She went very still. "Why?" "Because he recommended Cross for the committee position." He held her gaze. "And I want to understand whether he knew what Cross was when he recommended him." She absorbed that. Did he answer? "He's coming in." The next 20 minutes were the particular kind of tense that doesn't look like anything from the outside. People arriving, sitting down, arranging papers, speaking in quiet professional voices, but that she could feel in the back of her throat and in the specific tightness across her shoulders that she'd been carrying since 6 in the morning. Carla Mendez arrived first, in the same precise clothes she'd worn that morning, as though she hadn't been home either or had simply decided that the situation didn't warrant a change of appearance. She looked at the boardroom, at Adrian, at Elara, and said, "Show me what you have." Elara showed her. All of it, organized the way she'd organized it for Marcus, but faster now because Carla processed quickly and didn't need the connective tissue explained. When she finished, Carla said, "He'll move tomorrow. He won't wait past tomorrow." "That's our assessment too," Marcus said. "So we move tonight." Carla looked at Adrian. "You need to remove him from the committee before he has a chance to present the modified audit as evidence of anything." "I can't remove him without cause that I can document," Adrian said. "Not without creating a wrongful removal claim that creates its own exposure. The cross-meridian positions relative to Caldwell give you cause. The Mercer-Ballard recommendation gives you cause. The communication records between him and Gerald give you cause." Carla's voice was precise and dry. "Marcus, how solid is that cause?" Marcus set down his pen. "Solid enough to move on with appropriate documentation. The cross-meridian positions create a disclosure failure. He should have disclosed the full scope of his financial interest in Caldwell when the acquisition came to the committee. He didn't." "Is that enough?" Adrian said. "It's enough to remove him for cause and defend the removal if challenged." Marcus paused. "What I can't guarantee is that his response doesn't include a simultaneous public release of the modified audit documents." The room absorbed that. "If he releases the modified version before we can establish the original," Elara said, "the narrative runs for however long it takes to correct it. And correction never catches up to the initial story." "How long to establish the original?" Carla said. "I have it, right now, the draft with timestamps." She set the printed copy on the table. "What I don't have is Lyle on record confirming the modification." "Lyle won't confirm anything voluntarily," Marcus said. "He's got exposure on the alteration. potential fraud, professional misconduct. Then what does Lyle want? Carla said. Everyone looked at her. He's been sitting on this for 14 months too, Carla said, carrying the knowledge that he altered a signed audit document. That's not comfortable. What does he want? The room was quiet. Elara thought about Robert Lyle, thought about the man she'd known at Aldridge and Park. Not a bad person, not a courageous one. The kind of person who made compromises by telling himself they weren't compromises, and who carried the weight of that telling in the particular way of someone who had never fully convinced themselves. He wants it to be over, she said. Carla looked at her. Then give him a way to end it. He'd need immunity from professional action, Marcus said immediately, and probably a structured disclosure tape. He comes forward, confirms the alteration, provides documentation of Cross's instruction or inducement to make the change, in exchange for a negotiated resolution rather than a formal complaint. Can we offer that? Adrian said. We can offer to recommend it to the relevant professional bodies. We can't guarantee it. Marcus picked up his phone. But the offer is worth making tonight if we're going to move on Cross before morning. Call him, Adrian said. Marcus stepped out. The room breathed for a moment. Gerald arrived at 9:05. He looked different from how he'd looked that morning, and he'd already looked stripped down that morning, without the professional surface that had been his default mode for 9 years. Now he looked like someone who had spent the intervening hours sitting with something and had arrived at a decision about it, but didn't yet know if the decision was going to be accepted. He stopped in the doorway, took in the room. Elara, Adrian, Carla, Priya, with her notepad. He looked last at Adrian and held that. Sit down, Gerald, Adrian said, not unkindly, with the specific quality of kindness that is sadder than harshness because it's accurate. Gerald sat down. Harlan Cross, Adrian said, when you recommended him for the committee, what did you know? A long pause. Gerald's hands were flat on the table, and she could see the slight tension in them. Not hiding it, just carrying it. I knew he had positions in infrastructure-adjacent sectors, Gerald said. I knew he'd been in a dispute with a forensic accountant at a previous firm over an audit that had affected one of his investments. He paused. I didn't know the accountant was her. A small motion toward Elara. I didn't know the connection until after she arrived. When did you figure it out? Elara said. He looked at her. About 3 weeks after you started, when you mentioned Aldridge and Park in passing. A pause. I didn't say anything. Because by then the Caldwell deal was well underway, and Cross was useful to the deal. His jaw tightened. That's not a justification. That's what happened. Did Cross know you'd figured it out? Adrian said. He called me, after she'd been here about a month. Gerald's voice was flat and deliberate. The voice of someone who has decided that precision matters more than self-protection right now. He told me she'd cost him money at Aldridge. He said it would be better for the deal if the reassessment process didn't involve her. And you said? I said I'd handle it. He stopped. I didn't handle it. I kept finding reasons not to, and eventually Caldwell was in front of the board, and I thought it would just resolve itself. The room was very quiet. Gerald, Elara said, the Mercer-Ballard recommendation. Did Cross suggest it, or did you go looking? He met her eyes. He suggested it, 3 weeks after that phone call, said they were a strong new firm with fresh perspective. A beat. I knew what I was taking. I told myself the deal was right, the valuation would hold up, and the methodology was the only problem. He looked at the table. The methodology was the whole problem. Adrian hadn't moved. His hands were still, his face was still, and the stillness had the quality she'd come to understand was the outer surface of something that cost him significant effort. You've been with this company 9 years, he said. Yes. And in 9 years, this is the first time. Gerald looked up, something raw in his face. Yes. I believe you. Adrian's voice was quiet. That doesn't change what it is. I know. Marcus came back in. He caught Adrian's eye and gave a small nod. Something had happened on his call with Lyle, and whatever it was enough to continue with. Adrian looked at Gerald. I'm going to ask you to make a formal statement tonight. Everything you've told me in this room, on record, with counsel present. the timeline of your communication with Cross, the Mercer Ballard recommendation, the phone call. Gerald nodded, slowly. In exchange, I will advocate for a structured separation rather than a formal termination for cause. I make no other promises. Adrian held his gaze. This is the last thing I can offer you. Another long pause. Okay, Gerald said. Okay. Priya took him to an adjacent room with a junior attorney Marcus had called in. The boardroom was quieter without him. Carla looked at Adrian. Lyle? Marcus, Adrian said. Marcus sat back down. Lyle will confirm the modification. He has documentation. The original instruction from Cross came in writing, which is the kind of mistake that happens when someone is confident they'll never need to answer for it. He'll provide that documentation in exchange for a managed process. He paused. He's frightened. He's been frightened for 14 months. We'll need his confirmation and Cross's instruction document before we move on the committee removal, Carla said. Otherwise, Cross can claim the removal's retaliatory. We'll have it by midnight, Marcus said. It was 9:47. Elara stood up. I need to work, she said. I need to have the full evidentiary package built before Marcus has what he needs, so that when he's ready to move, we move immediately. Adrian looked at her. What do you need? Coffee, she said, and for everyone to stay out of my way for 2 hours. Someone brought coffee. She sat at the boardroom table with her laptop and her files and the printed copy of her draft, and built the package. Methodical, precise, each piece of evidence documented and sourced and cross-referenced. The timeline constructed so that it told the story in the sequence that made the logic unmissable. She was aware of the room around her, Marcus on the phone in the corner, Carla reviewing documents at the far end of the table, Adrian moving between his office and the boardroom in a circuit that she'd stopped tracking because tracking it was distracting, and she needed to not be distracted. At 11:15, Marcus sat down across from her, set a document on the table. She looked at it. An email chain, 3 messages, between Harlan Cross and Robert Lyle. The first message from Cross. The instruction in clear language. The findings on pages 12, 17, and 23 needed to reflect a more conservative liability estimate. The second message from Lyle confirming the change had been made. The third message from Cross, 2 words. Good. Delete this. Lyle hadn't deleted it. She read it twice. Then she looked at Marcus. Pages 12, 17, and 23, she said, match the 3 modifications in the delivery version. She opened her draft. Turned to page 12. The original finding was there, exactly as she'd written it, in language that the delivery version had softened into meaninglessness. She turned the draft to face Marcus. He read it, sat back. That's your case. She nodded. Adrian was behind her. She became aware of it before she heard him, the particular quality of his presence in a room. He leaned over her shoulder and read the email chain without touching anything, which was a quality she'd noticed in him before, the ability to be very close to something without disturbing it. He straightened up. Remove him tonight, he said to Marcus. Not loudly, but with the quality of a decision that has been made and will not be revisited. The formal removal requires a committee notification. Draft it now. I'll sign it at midnight. Have it delivered to Cross's home address and his attorney of record by 6 in the morning. Marcus nodded and pulled out his laptop. Carla looked at Adrian. He'll fight it. Let him fight it, Adrian said. With what? The next hour was the specific grinding work of legal documentation. Marcus drafting, Priya cross-checking, Elara reviewing every piece of the evidentiary package for gaps, finding 2 and filling them, finding a third and deciding it wasn't a gap but a legitimate ambiguity that the documentation around it resolved. At 12:03, Adrian signed the removal notice. At 12:17, Marcus confirmed Lyle's formal statement was complete and notarized. At 12:29, Carla stood up, put on her coat, and said, "You did good work tonight." She looked at Elara when she said it, but then at Adrian because she was the kind of person who understood that good work doesn't happen in a vacuum. Then she left. The boardroom was quiet. Priya and the junior attorney were still at the far end, organizing documents. Marcus was on a call in the corner. But the main part of the room, The head of the table where she'd been sitting and the chair across from it where Adrian had been when he wasn't pacing had a sudden quality of stillness. He sat down across from her again. Same positions as the beginning of the evening, but something in the room was different from how it had been at 8:15, when she'd arrived with the new information and the specific controlled terror she'd acknowledged to him and then set aside to work. She was tired, the kind of tired that is below the surface of the body, not in the muscles, but in the mechanism. "It's not over," she said, because it wasn't, and she knew it, and she thought he knew it too, but might need someone to say it. "No," he said. "He'll lawyer up by 6:01. There'll be a counter-narrative. There'll be calls to board members. The evidence is clean." "Evidence is clean," he agreed. "Doesn't mean it's fast." She looked at him. He looked at her. The low light of the boardroom was doing something specific to the angles of his face, not softening them exactly, but showing them differently than they appeared in the full professional light of the daytime, less controlled by the surface and more by whatever was underneath it. "You said you wanted to have a different kind of conversation," she said, "when this was over." He looked at her. "It's not over." "No," she said, "but I'm raising it now anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was still doing what cities do at midnight. Lit, moving, indifferent. She'd stopped finding it impersonal and started finding it steadying, somewhere in the last 3 months. A thing that continued regardless. "I've been in this building for 17 years, he said. "I have built something that most people would describe as extraordinary, and I don't disagree with that description, and it has cost me a very specific set of things that I told myself were the price of the work." He paused. "I told myself that for a long time." She waited. 3 months ago, an accountant who had been here 11 days told me I was wrong in front of 23 people. The almost smile, but fuller than she'd seen it before, with something underneath it she hadn't seen there. "And instead of doing what I've done every other time someone challenged me in that room," he stopped. "You said continue," she said. "I said continue." He looked at her directly. "I've been trying to understand why since that morning." She held that. The room was very quiet. "I think," she said carefully, "that you recognize something." "What did I recognize?" "That I wasn't trying to take anything from you." She kept her voice level, because level was the only register she trusted when something mattered. "I wasn't competing with you. I wasn't positioning myself. I just needed the number to be right." He was watching her with the focused quality that she'd learned over 3 months wasn't measurement anymore. It had become something else. And she hadn't named it because naming it would have required her to stop working, and she couldn't stop working. "You're the only person in this building," he said, "who has never once tried to figure out what I want to hear." "I'm not interested in what you want to hear," she said. "I'm interested in what's true." "I know." A pause. He stopped, started again. "It's the most important thing anyone has given me in 17 years of running this company, and I'm aware that's a significant statement, and I'm making it anyway." She looked at him across the table, at the controlled, complicated, genuinely exhausted face of a man who had built an empire partly by never letting anyone close enough to see that it was costing him something, and who was now in a boardroom at 12:30 in the morning, choosing not to maintain that distance. She thought about what she'd said to Carla Mendez that morning. "We're working on it." She opened her mouth to say something. She didn't know what exactly, but something that was honest, which was the only kind of thing she knew how to say, when Marcus appeared at the edge of the room. "Cross's attorney just called," he said. Both of them looked at him. Marcus's face was careful in a way that meant the news was not simple. He received advance notification of the removal. Someone tipped him. A pause. "He's filing an injunction tonight to block the removal and simultaneously releasing a statement to the financial press." He looked at Elara. "The statement includes the modified audit documents and an allegation that the forensic evidence against him was fabricated by an individual with a documented history of disputed audit findings." The room went very still. "He's going public tonight," Adrian said. "The statement goes out at 1 a.m., 40 minutes. 40 minutes. She stood up. Her chair scraped back on the floor, and she was already thinking, already moving through the sequence. What went out at 1 a.m.? What could be in front of it? what the options were for getting the original documentation into the hands of people who would report it before Cross's version became the established story. "Who covers financial misconduct at the Tribune?" she said. Marcus blinked. "What?" "The Tribune. Who's their financial misconduct reporter?" She looked at him. "Someone in this room knows." A pause. Then Carla Mendez's voice from the doorway. She hadn't left, or she'd come back, and Elara didn't have time to determine which. "Dana Kirsch," Carla said. "She broke the Fontaine Capital story 2 years ago." She already had her phone out. "I have her personal number." Adrian looked at Elara. The question in his face was clear. "Are you sure?" Going to the press with an incomplete investigation before the legal process had fully resolved was the kind of move that couldn't be undone. It would shape every subsequent step. It would put her name and her documentation and her 3 months of work in front of an audience that would form its conclusions before all the evidence was in. It was also the only way to get the original in front of the public before the modified version became the story. She met his eyes. "I'm sure," she said. He looked at her for one more second, then he nodded. "Make the call," he said to Carla. Carla was already dialing. Elara picked up the printed copy of her original draft and the email chain between Cross and Lyle and stood in the middle of the boardroom at 12:34 in the morning, 36 minutes before Harlan Cross's version of the last 18 months of her professional life went out to every financial desk in the city and thought, this is what it costs. Not the money she didn't have at stake, not the career she'd built carefully and protected instinctively. Not even the 3 months in this building, the weekly reports and the Tuesday meetings and the authority matrix and the checklist and the CFO she'd watched resign and the complicated man across the table who'd said, continue when no one else in 17 years had given him a reason to. What it cost was the certainty. The clean, manageable life she'd built out of the certainty that if the numbers were right, everything else would follow. That accuracy was sufficient, that the truth, clearly presented, would land where it belonged. That had been true, mostly, for long enough that she'd stopped examining whether it was always true. She looked at Adrian. He was already looking at her. Carla said into the phone, "Dana, I know what time it is. Listen to me." And the next 36 minutes began. Dana Kirsch picked up on the third word, not the third sentence. The third word out of Carla Mendez's mouth, which was cross, and the quality of attention that came through the phone. After that single word was the attention of someone who had been watching a story from a distance and just heard the door open. Elara sat across from Carla and listened to one side of the conversation and organized the documents in the order they'd need to be transmitted. The email chain first, Cross's instruction to Lyle, in Cross's own words, with the timestamp that predated the delivery of the modified audit by 6 days. Then her original draft, with its own timestamps, the 3 findings intact in her language. Then the cross-meridian corporate filing that established his financial position in Crestfield through the intermediary structures. 3 documents. A story that told itself if you read them in sequence. Carla held the phone toward her. "She wants to talk to you." She took it. "Miss Kirsch." "Dana." The voice was alert in the way of someone who runs on compressed sleep and strong coffee and the specific adrenaline of a story arriving at the right moment. "Carla says you have documentation. I have an email chain establishing that Harlan Cross instructed the senior partner of my former firm to alter 3 findings in a signed audit document. I have the original draft of that document with timestamps that predate the alteration. I have corporate filings establishing Cross's financial interest in the company the audit concerned." She paused. "Cross is releasing a statement to the financial press at 1 a.m. alleging that I fabricated evidence against him. The statement will include the modified audit as supporting documentation." A short silence. "And your documentation establishes that the modification was made at his direction?" "Yes." "I need digital copies. Now." She looked at Marcus, who was already holding out his hand. She gave him the documents. He photographed each page with his phone and sent them to an address Donna Kirsch read out loud, and Elara watched him do it with the specific feeling of a person releasing something they've been holding, not knowing if it will land where it needs to. "I'll have something up before 1, Dana said. "It won't be complete, but it'll be there." "That's all I need," Elara said. She handed the phone back to Carla. The next 31 minutes were the worst kind of waiting. The kind where there's nothing left to do but let things move at the speed they move, which is never the speed you want. Marcus paced. Priya organized files that were already organized. Carla sat with the stillness of someone who had been in high-stakes rooms before and understood that stillness was the only useful thing left. Adrian stood at the window. She watched him from where she was sitting, at the boardroom table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and she thought about the particular quality of his stillness, how it had changed over 3 months from something she'd read as control to something she now understood was more complicated than that. The control was real, but underneath it was something she recognized because she had a version of it herself. The specific weight of a person who cares about what they've built more than they can easily say, and who has just watched that thing become vulnerable in ways they didn't fully design. At 12:58, Dana Kirsch's piece went live. It wasn't complete. It was careful, legally hedged, built around the documentation they'd sent, rather than the full investigative picture. But it was there, with the email chain quoted directly and the original audit draft referenced and Cross's name in the headline. And when Marcus refreshed the page at 1:02 and the Cross statement had also gone out, the story that was available to anyone reading was not the one Cross had intended to tell. She read both pieces back to back. Cross's statement was well constructed. She gave him that. It laid the alternative narrative cleanly. The disputed audit history, the allegation of fabricated evidence, the framing of his removal from the committee as retaliation by a compromised executive protecting her own position. It was the story that would have landed if it had arrived alone. It hadn't arrived alone. She set down her phone. "It's not over," she said. Same thing she'd said to Adrian at midnight. Because it wasn't, and the repetition of true things was sometimes all you had. "No," Marcus said, "but the narrative is contested. That's what tonight was for." She nodded. Adrian turned from the window. He looked at her across the room with an expression she didn't try to categorize because she was too tired for categorization and because some things lose something when you put a name on them too quickly. "Go home," he said. To her, and also to the room in general. She went home. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. The weeks that followed were not clean. She'd known they wouldn't be, and knowing hadn't made them easier, but it had meant she wasn't surprised by them, which was the closest thing to an advantage she'd been able to maintain. Cross filed the injunction. It was denied within 72 hours on the basis of the disclosure failure that Marcus had documented, the inadequate reporting of his cross-meridian positions when he'd been appointed to the committee. The denial was a legal outcome, not a public one, and the public story continued to be contested for longer than that. There were 2 weeks in which she read things about herself in financial publications that were carefully worded to stop just short of actionable while conveying clearly that her professional record was the subject of legitimate inquiry. She read them and noted them and gave them to Marcus and continued working because the work was what she could control and the narrative was not. Lyle's formal statement became public in the 3rd week. It was the piece that changed the direction of the story. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. Robert Lyle, in the careful language of a man who had decided that truth was finally the lower-cost option, confirmed every detail of the modification. The original instruction, the changes made, the email he'd been told to delete and hadn't for reasons he described as discomfort, which was the most honest word anyone had used in the entire chain of events. Cross's legal team issued a response calling Lyle's statement the product of coercion and promised further action. The further action never materialized in any form she could identify. The Caldwell reassessment came back in the 5th week. A firm selected by Carla Mendez and 2 other board members, with no connection to anyone involved in the original process, delivered a valuation that put the supportable acquisition price at 18% below the original proposal. The Caldwell Group's principals, when approached with the revised offer, declined to negotiate. Adrian walked away from the deal. She heard about it from Margaret, who delivered the information in passing with the neutral face she used for things she considered self-evident. That evening, Adrian appeared in her doorway. She looked up from the Authority Matrix implementation review she'd been finalizing, the work they'd started together 4 months ago, which had taken this long to move from framework to documented operational reality. Caldwell said no, he said. "I heard." He came in, sat down across from her desk. She set down her pen. $400 million deal, he said. 9 months of work. Yes. And you're going to tell me I did the right thing. You did the right thing, she said. You also lost a $400 million deal. Both of those things are true and neither one cancels the other. He looked at her. The almost smile, she'd stopped calling it that in her mind sometime in the last few weeks because it had become simply his smile, the real one, the one that wasn't performed for rooms. I've been thinking about that board presentation, he said. The first one. When you stood up and told me the numbers were wrong. You said continue. I've been thinking about why. He leaned back slightly. I told myself it was because the evidence was clear, because the logical response was to hear the rest of it. Wasn't it? Partly. He was quiet for a moment. Partly it was because you were the first person who'd ever looked at something I'd done and found a problem and brought it to me without wanting something for finding it. He paused. That's rarer than it should be. She thought about the first morning, the boardroom, the 23 people and the quality of silence when she'd finished presenting, the weight of what she'd walked into without fully knowing what it was. I wanted the numbers to be right, she said. I still want that. I know. He looked at her steadily. That's not a small thing. You understand that. She held that, thought about what it had cost, not the weeks of contested narrative, not the late nights and the legal process, and the particular exhaustion of a fight she hadn't started. Something more fundamental. The version of her work she'd been doing before this building, the clean and manageable version where accuracy was sufficient and the truth landed where it should and the price was never more than she'd agreed to pay. That version was gone. She'd walked into this building and 3 months later she'd walked into a boardroom at midnight and released documents to a reporter she'd never met and made a bet on evidence against a man who had 17 months of preparation and the specific ruthlessness of someone protecting financial loss. She'd been right. The evidence had held, but right was not the same as cost-free, and she was still learning where the costs had landed in herself. I understand it, she said. The Authority Matrix implementation report was on her desk. She pushed it across to him. He looked at it, then at her. What's this? The final implementation document. Every decision category, every assigned authority, the review protocol, the documentation requirements. She nodded at it. Sign it, and it becomes operational policy. He picked it up, flipped through it, not the quick flip of someone performing review, but the real reading she'd watched him do from the beginning, the kind that meant he was actually in it. Page 7, she said. He turned to page 7, read the section she'd indicated. His expression changed slightly. Something in the set of his jaw, a small shift. You gave yourself a review function on acquisitions above a certain threshold, he said. Yes. That's not the CFO's traditional scope. No. She held his gaze. But it's the scope that would have caught the Hartwell error before it became the Hartwell error, and it's the scope that puts a second set of eyes on due diligence processes before they go to the board. A pause. You can remove it. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he picked up her pen from where she'd set it down and signed the document. Put the pen back where he'd found it, with a precision that was characteristic. Don't remove it, he said. She took the document back. The cross matter resolved formally in the 8th week, in the specific way that these things resolve when the documentation is clean and the alternative narrative has run out of new material. Not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a series of quiet procedural steps that added up collectively to an ending. Cross resigned from 2 other boards in the same week his attorney communicated that he was withdrawing the legal challenges. The Cross Meridian Fund closed 6 weeks after that. She tracked it in the public filings, not because she needed to, but because she was constitutionally unable to leave a thread unpulled. The Aldridge and Park professional body complaint against Lyle resulted in a censure and a mandatory supervised practice period. She'd had no formal role in the outcome, but Marcus had submitted her documentation to the reviewing body, and the reviewing body had used it. Robert Lyle called her in the 10th week. She almost didn't answer. Then she did, because not answering things that needed to be faced was not a quality she had. Ms. Whitmore. His voice was different from how she remembered it. The confident Midwestern steadiness she'd worked under for 6 years had a different quality now, thinner, like material that had been stretched. Mr. Lyle, a pause. I wanted to say, he stopped, started again. I wanted to say that I know the statement I gave came very late. I know that's not nothing. No, she agreed, it's not nothing. Cross told me when he asked me to make the changes that the findings were technically defensible from a different interpretive angle. He was convincing about the technical case. A pause. I knew it was wrong. I told myself the technical argument was real. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of a person reading themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time. I was wrong. She held the phone and looked out her window at the parking structure and thought about what to say to that. Not what he needed to hear, what was true. You kept the email, she said. A long silence. Yes. That matters, she said. It's not everything, but it matters. She ended the call. Outside the window, it was the kind of afternoon that didn't announce itself. Gray but not dark, cold but not bitter. The city going about its business in the particular and different way of cities that have been there longer than anyone in them and expect to be there long after. She went back to work. The CFO search concluded in the 11th week. She had been interim for 3 months by then, long enough that the interim had become the operational reality without anyone quite deciding it officially. When Marcus presented her with the formal appointment documents, she read them with the same attention she gave everything, found nothing she needed to change, and signed them. Margaret sent her a card, handwritten, on good paper, in the precise penmanship of someone who had learned it in a different era and maintained it as a form of respect for language. Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore. The building is different since you arrived. I mean that as a compliment. She kept the card. It was the only thing on her desk that wasn't work. The annual Voss Foundation Gala was in the 14th week. She hadn't attended the previous years because she hadn't been there for it, and she would have happily not attended this one either, except that Adrian had put her name on the invitation list in a way that made not attending a more complicated act than attending. She wore the same dress she wore to every formal event, dark, well-cut, chosen years ago for its quality of making her look like herself, rather than like someone performing a version of herself for the occasion. She arrived on time, which meant she arrived before most people, which was fine. The gala was the kind of event where money and influence circulate in a social medium, each person performing their version of ease for an audience of people performing the same thing. She was not good at this kind of event and had no illusions about becoming good at it. She found a position near the window, her instinct always to have her back to something solid and her face to the room, and held a glass of water and watched. Vivian Sterling arrived 40 minutes in. Elara knew who she was the way she knew most of the people in this room, from reading, from the particular research habit she'd never fully turned off. Sterling was the wife of a significant donor to the foundation, possessed of the specific social confidence that comes from having navigated rooms like this one for decades, and had a reputation for the kind of commentary that was phrased as observation and functioned as evaluation. She found Elara near the window with the accuracy of someone who knew exactly where the people were who hadn't yet been properly acknowledged and felt it was her function to do the acknowledging. Ms. Whitmore, Sterling said. Her voice was warm in the particular way of warmth that is a performance of warmth rather than the thing itself. The new CFO. I've been meaning to introduce myself. Mrs. Sterling. Sterling looked her over with the practiced discretion of someone who has made a life of assessment. It's wonderful, isn't it, what Adrian has built here? The foundation especially. It requires such vision. It does, Elara agreed. I imagine your work is quite different. The numbers side of things. A small, inclusive smile. So essential, but so removed from the kind of human judgment that leadership really requires. She held that. Turned it over, recognized it for what it was without difficulty, because this kind of comment had a specific structure that she'd encountered before, in different registers, from different directions, always carrying the same basic content. You are a technical function, not a person of consequence. She considered her options, which took approximately 2 seconds. The numbers side of things, she said pleasantly, is where I found the $18 million error that protected this organization's largest acquisition from a significant loss. It's also where I identified the fraudulent audit scheme that resulted in the removal of a compromised committee member and prevented a $400 million deal from closing on manipulated terms. She held Sterling's gaze. I find that numbers require a considerable amount of human judgment. Sterling blinked. Just once. Elara took a small sip of her water. Across the room, she became aware of Adrian. She'd known where he was since she arrived. It was a habit she'd stopped examining. And she became aware that he'd been watching and that he'd heard. Sterling recovered with the agility of someone who has been in enough rooms to know that recovery is always available if you move fast enough. She made a graceful comment about the room's flowers and excused herself, and Elara watched her go and felt not triumph exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of a correction delivered cleanly. Adrian appeared at her side sometime after that. Not immediately. He gave it enough time that it wasn't a rescue, which she appreciated because she didn't need rescuing, and they both knew it. "Vivian Sterling," he said. "I handled it." "I know." He was looking at the room, not at her, which was its own kind of conversational privacy. She said something. She implied that working with numbers was removed from human judgment. I disagreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Did you enjoy it?" "No," she said honestly. "I find this kind of thing exhausting, but it needed to be said, so I said it." He turned and looked at her, fully looked, in the way he did when he decided something deserved his full attention rather than the peripheral variety. "I'm going to say something," he said, "in the remarks. I want you to know before I say it." She looked at him. "What?" "The Foundation's results this year, the numbers behind them, the expansion we were able to fund, the risks we were able to take because the financial foundation was clean." He paused. "I'm going to say your name." She processed this. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. It'll change how people see the role, and how they see me." "Yes," he said. "I know that too." She held it, the visibility she'd been avoiding since the day she arrived, the name in the room that changed the room's orientation, that made her a named thing rather than a functional one, that required her to exist in the story rather than behind it. She thought about what it had cost to exist behind it. The email at 6:47 in the evening, the man in her doorway with his careful smile, the weeks of contested narrative, and the 4 hours of sleep, and the press piece that had gone live at 12:58, and the document she'd released into someone else's hands, not knowing for certain where it would land. "Okay," she said. He went to the stage. She stayed near the window and listened to him speak. Not the performance of public speech, but the actual version of it, the one where a person's real cadence comes through. And when he said her name, she felt the room shift its attention in her direction, and she didn't look away from it. She stood there and let herself be seen. After the remarks, when the room had redistributed itself into its smaller conversational configurations, Carla Mendez appeared beside her with a glass of champagne she held but didn't drink. "You didn't flinch," Carla said. "I flinched internally," Elara said. Carla made a sound that was the closest she'd come to a laugh in all their interactions. "Good. Means you're paying attention." She looked at the room. "You know what he just did. He made my work visible." "He gave it to you," Carla said. "The credit is a small part. What he gave you is the position." She paused. "There are people in this room who will work with you differently after tonight, not all of them in ways you'll like." "I know. And you're comfortable with that." Elara thought about comfortable, about the word's history in her life, the clean, manageable life where comfortable had meant something straightforward, and about what comfortable meant now, after everything the last 4 months had moved through her. "I'm ready for it," she said. "That's different from comfortable." Carla nodded, moved away. The room continued its slow rotation. Later, much later, when the event had wound down and the room was half empty and the serving staff were moving with the particular quiet efficiency of people who have been doing this for hours, she found herself standing near the window again. Adrian came and stood beside her. They stood like that for a moment, looking at the city. The same city she'd looked at from his office window 3 months ago, in the afternoon light, when he'd looked at her and said, Come to the board presentation Thursday. The same city that had been doing its indifferent business outside her small window with the view of the parking structure while she'd built cases and signed documents and answered calls from people who were afraid and people who were threatening and people who were, in their own damaged way, trying to end her. It was just a city. It continued. The authority matrix is operational, she said. I know. The CFO search is concluded. I know that too. The Caldwell reassessment is filed. The cross matter is closed. The Hartwell corrections are reflected in the current financial statements. She paused. The things that needed to be fixed are fixed. He turned and looked at her. Is that your way of telling me you've completed the job you were hired for? He said. It's my way of telling you the building is in better shape than it was. It is. He looked at her steadily. Are you staying? She'd been thinking about that question since the formal CFO appointment had come through. Not because the answer was uncertain, but because she'd wanted to understand why the answer was what it was. Why this building? Why this particular complicated work? Why a man at the head of a table who had said continue and meant it in a way she hadn't expected? I'm staying, she said. Something in his face that she didn't try to name because she was tired of naming things in place of simply letting them be. Good, he said. They stood looking at the city for a moment longer. Outside, the lights were doing what lights do at this hour. Brighter against the dark, more specific, each one a discrete point of warmth in the cold geometry of the skyline. You're going to find something wrong next week, he said. Almost certainly, she said, and you'll bring it to me. Directly, with documentation. And I'll look at it. And you'll push back. And you'll hold your position. Until the evidence says I shouldn't. He was quiet for a moment, then, I've learned more in 4 months of being wrong than in 17 years of being right. She considered this. It was a significant statement, and he was making it to the city rather than to her, which she understood was the only way he'd found to make it yet. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said. It's not. She turned away from the window, set her empty water glass on the tray of a passing server, picked up her bag from the coat check without hurrying. At the door, she turned back. He was still at the window, still looking at the city, but she could see, in the particular quality of his stillness, that he was aware of her turning, aware of the doorway, aware of everything in the room that had just happened and everything that was still settling. Tomorrow, she said, there's a problem in the quarterly tax calculation I want to walk you through. He turned his head, the smile, though full now, unhidden, the real one that she'd watched emerge over 4 months from whatever it had been buried under. My office at 9, he said. She walked out into the city, which was cold and lit and continuing, the way cities do, without reference to anything that had just happened inside one of its 43-story buildings. The cases built, and the documents released, and the deals walked away from, and the names said out loud in rooms where names had weight. The city didn't care. She found that as she walked, she didn't mind. The work would be there in the morning. The building would be there. The quarterly tax calculation with its problem on an interior page, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. And when she found it, she would bring it to him, and he would say, continue, and she would. That was the whole thing. It was enough.